The village of St. Mary Mead had seen many fine autumn afternoons, but few could rival the golden perfection of this particular Sunday. The church bells had just finished their melodious summons to evensong when the congregation spilled onto the church lawn for the annual Harvest Festival social, a tradition so deeply embedded in village life that even the threat of rain wouldn't have deterred it. Fortunately, the weather had cooperated splendidly, painting the sky in shades of pale amber and rose. Miss Jane Marple, seated on a weathered wooden bench beneath the ancient oak tree, watched the proceedings with the contented air of someone who had witnessed this same ritual for more decades than she cared to count. Her knitting needles moved with practiced efficiency, so though her pale blue eyes, sharp as cut glass despite her years, rarely looked down at the growing wool in her lap. Instead, they catalogued the scene before her with the precision of a naturalist observing wildlife. The trestle tables groaned under the weight of the village's finest contributions. Mrs. Henderson's famous Victoria sponge, the vicar's wife's rather dry scones. Bless her heart, she tried. Young Timothy Fletcher's surprisingly accomplished chocolate gâteau, and, pride of place, Mrs. Gladys Emsworth's legendary meat and potato pie, still steaming gently in its fluted ceramic dish. "She's outdone herself this year," remarked Miss Hartnell, lowering herself onto the bench beside Miss Marple with considerably less grace. Miss Hartnell was a large woman with an even larger capacity for gossip. Yes, and she had positioned herself strategically to observe the tea-urn and the pie table simultaneously. "You know Gladys entered it in the county fair last month. Didn't win, mind you, but only because Judge Patterson has been carrying a grudge since her husband refused to sell him that strip of land by the river." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Human nature," she murmured, "is remarkably consistent in its pettiness." "Quite right, quite right." Miss Hartnell leaned closer, her voice dropping to what she imagined was a confidential whisper, but which carried quite adequately to the neighboring benches. "Though between you and me, Jane, I do think Gladys has become insufferably proud about her cooking. Why, just last week at the Women's Institute, she practically sneered at poor Mrs. Denton's shepherd's pie. I said the seasoning was pedestrian." "Pedestrian," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully, as if filing the word away for future reference. The object of their discussion, Mrs. Gladys Emsworth, stood near the refreshment table like a queen surveying her domain. She was a handsome woman in her late 50s, with steel-grey hair arranged in elaborate waves and a figure that spoke of both good corsetry and careful maintenance. Her dress, a flattering dove-grey silk with pearl buttons, was slightly too elegant for a church social, but Gladys Emsworth had never been one to dress down for any occasion. Beside her, looking considerably less comfortable, stood her daughter Rosemary, a faded young woman of perhaps 35, with her mother's features but none of her commanding presence. Rosemary wore a shapeless brown cardigan over a floral dress that had seen better days, and she kept her eyes fixed on the ground as her mother spoke animatedly to the vicar. "Poor Rosemary," Miss Hartnell continued her running commentary. "Sacrificed her whole life caring for that invalid father, and what does she have to show for it? Still living under her mother's thumb, no prospects, no life of her own. Arthur Emsworth's been dead these 2 years, and Gladys still treats the girl like an unpaid servant." Miss Marple's expression remained placid, but her needles paused for the briefest moment. "One does wonder," she said gently, "what becomes of devotion when it's taken for granted for too long. I recall a parlour maid in my youth, such a patient, loyal girl. But when she finally reached her limit, well..." She shook her head sadly. Aunt's human nature can only bear so much. Before Miss Hartnell could request the full story, a cheerful voice interrupted them. "Miss Marple, how lovely to see you out and about." Dr. Charles Haydock, the village physician, approached with the easy stride of a man comfortable in his own skin. He was a vigorous 60, with a weathered face that spoke of countless country walks and a general air of no-nonsense competence that made him popular with patients and villagers alike. "Doctor," Miss Marple greeted him with genuine warmth, I wouldn't miss the harvest festival for the world. Besides, the fresh air is excellent for one's constitution." "Quite right, quite right." He glanced toward the refreshment table where his wife, a plump, cheerful woman in sensible tweeds, was helping to distribute teacups. "I see, Mrs. Emsworth has graced us with another of her famous pies. Frankly, I'm surprised she's willing to share them with us common folk. I heard she's been approached by that fancy London catering company. What's it called? Delacroix and Associates. They want her recipes." "Indeed." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose fractionally. "How enterprising." "Though if you ask me," Dr. Haydock lowered his voice, "she'd be better off looking after that daughter of hers instead of pursuing culinary glory. Young Rosemary looked positively peaky last time I saw her. Stress, I'd wager, and—" He hesitated, then continued in an even lower tone. "I happened to be passing their cottage last Tuesday evening. There was quite the row going on. Raised voices, something smashing. Not my business, of course, but—" He trailed off as the vicar, Reverend Leonard Clement, approached the microphone that had been set up near the refreshment table. The vicar was a gentle, scholarly man whose sermons were notable for their kindness rather than their theological sophistication, which suited St. Mary Mead perfectly. "Dear friends," he began, and the assembled villagers gradually quieted. "What a magnificent turnout. I want to thank everyone who contributed to this year's Harvest Festival. As you know, all proceeds will go toward repairing the church roof, a project that becomes more urgent with each rainfall." Polite laughter rippled through the crowd. "Before we commence our tea, I'd like to ask Mrs. Gladys Emsworth to say a few words about her remarkable pie, which will serve as our centerpiece for this afternoon's refreshments." Gladys Emsworth needed no further encouragement, till she stepped forward with the confidence of a woman accustomed to being the center of attention, her smile gracious, but somehow managing to convey a sense of superiority. "Thank you, Vicar. As many of you know, my meat and potato pie has been a family recipe for 3 generations. My grandmother, God rest her soul, perfected it during the war, the first one, that is, and it has been the pride of the Emsworth table ever since." She paused for effect. "This particular pie represents hours of careful preparation. Hand-minced beef from Henderson's butcher shop, potatoes from my own garden, and a secret blend of herbs that I'm afraid must remain precisely that, secret." A few people chuckled, though Miss Marple noticed that not all the laughter was entirely friendly. She observed young Timothy Fletcher, the amateur baker who worked as a clerk at the local solicitor's office, watching Mrs. Emsworth with an expression that might have been admiration or might have been something rather less pleasant. Beside him, Margaret Blackwood, the village postmistress and an accomplished cook in her own right, had her lips pressed into a thin line. "Now then," Mrs. Emsworth concluded, "I invite you all to partake, though I must warn you, once you've tasted perfection, everything else may seem rather ordinary." The declaration was met with mixed reactions, some genuine appreciation, some polite applause, and some faces that suggested Mrs. Emsworth's confidence was not universally welcomed. "Well," Miss Hartnell muttered beside Miss Marple, "pride goes before a fall, as they say." Miss Marple continued her knitting, but her eyes remained fixed on the scene before her. She watched as Rosemary Emsworth cut the pie into neat portions, her hands shaking slightly as she wielded the serving knife. She watched as Mrs. Emsworth accepted compliments from well-wishers with regal nods. She watched as Dr. Haydock collected 2 plates, one for himself, one for his wife, and returned to their table with an appreciative smile. The afternoon continued in its pleasant, predictable way. Tea was poured, conversation flowed, and Mrs. Emsworth's pie disappeared slice by slice. Miss Marple accepted a small portion herself. She had learned long ago that participating in village rituals was essential to remaining invisible, and found it indeed excellently seasoned and perfectly baked. An hour passed. The sun began its descent, painting longer shadows across the church lawn. The children who had been playing near the far hedgerow were called back by their mothers. The vicar's wife began organizing volunteers to help clean up. And then, quite suddenly, Dr. Haydock stood up from his table with an expression of concern. "Gladys," he called out, moving quickly toward Mrs. Emsworth, who had seated herself at the head table. "Gladys, are you quite all right?" Mrs. Emsworth was not all right. Her face had gone a peculiar grayish white, and she was gripping the edge of the table with both hands. As the doctor reached her, she attempted to speak, but only a strangled gasp emerged. "Someone get my bag from the car," Dr. Haydock commanded, his voice cutting through the sudden anxious murmur of the crowd. "Quickly!" But even as young Fletcher ran toward the doctor's vehicle, Miss Marple, still seated on her bench, her needles now motionless, watched Mrs. Gladys Emsworth pitch forward onto the table, scattering teacups and sending her famous pie dish clattering to the ground, where it shattered into a dozen irreparable pieces. In the stunned silence that followed, Miss Marple's voice was barely a whisper. "Oh dear, how very unfortunate." Within minutes, it would become clear that unfortunate was a considerable understatement. Within hours, the word murder would be whispered in every cottage in St. Mary Mead, and Miss Jane Marple, her knitting carefully packed away, would begin the quiet, methodical work of untangling the truth from the carefully constructed web of village lies. The ambulance arrived within 20 minutes, though by then Dr. Haydock had already performed the grim task of confirming what everyone present had begun to suspect. Mrs. and Gladys Emsworth was dead. The church lawn, so recently filled with cheerful conversation and the clink of teacups, had transformed into something resembling a wake. Villagers stood in tight clusters, speaking in hushed tones that somehow carried further than their normal voices. The vicar's wife had taken charge of corralling the children into the church hall, though several had already witnessed enough to fuel nightmares. Rosemary Emsworth sat on the same bench Miss Marple had occupied earlier, her face blank with shock, while Miss Hartnell hovered nearby, making ineffectual soothing noises. Miss Marple had moved to a position near the refreshment table, not obviously eavesdropping, simply an elderly lady who seemed too stunned to move very far. Her knitting bag rested in her lap, but her hands remained still, on giving her the appearance of someone frozen by the afternoon's terrible events. In reality, her mind was working with the precision of a Swiss watch, cataloguing every reaction, every word, every telling gesture. "Poison," she heard Margaret Blackwood whisper to the small circle that had formed around her. The postmistress had a journalist's instinct for information and never hesitated to share it. "That's what Dr. Haydock said to his wife. I was standing right there. He said the symptoms were unmistakable. Convulsions, the pallor, the way her pupils dilated. Classic poisoning." But how? Timothy Fletcher's voice cracked slightly. His face had gone almost as pale as the deceased's. "I mean, we all ate the same food, drank the same tea." "Not quite all the same," interjected Dr. Haydock, who had approached the group with the weary authority of a man who just lost a patient. Mrs. Emsworth was the only one who had a second slice of her pie. She took it about 15 minutes before the incident. A collective gasp rippled through the listeners. Miss Marple's fingers twitched almost imperceptibly. "You mean the pie was poisoned?" Miss Hartnell's voice rose to a pitch that could have shattered crystal. "But that's impossible. Gladys made it herself in her own kitchen. Unless—" She paused dramatically, and every eye turned toward Rosemary Emsworth, still sitting motionless on the bench. Now, Dr. Haydock said sharply, though Miss Marple noticed he didn't look at Rosemary as he spoke. "Let's not start throwing accusations about. The police will sort this out, and Inspector Slack is on his way from Much Benham." The mention of Inspector Slack produced a chorus of groans. Detective Inspector Slack was known throughout the county for his aggressive interrogation style and his conviction that the most obvious suspect was invariably the guilty party. Miss Marple had crossed paths with him before, and the experience had not been pleasant. For Inspector Slack, at least. "Well, "I think it's perfectly obvious," declared Mrs. Henderson, the butcher's wife, with the confidence of someone who read detective novels religiously. It had to be someone who had access to the pie before it came her. That means someone in the Emsworth household. Her gaze flickered toward Rosemary with undisguised suspicion. "That's a terrible thing to suggest," the vicar protested weakly, though he too cast an uncomfortable glance in Rosemary's direction. "Is it, though?" Margaret Blackwood leaned forward, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that ensured everyone within 30 feet could hear perfectly. "We all know Rosemary has had a difficult time. Caring for her father all those years, never having a life of her own, and then the way Gladys treated her, ordering her about like a servant, criticizing everything she did. Why, just last week at the post office, I heard Gladys tell her she was useless as a chocolate teapot. Those were her exact words. That's hardly a motive for murder," Dr. Haydock objected, though his tone lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" Mrs. Henderson countered. "Years of suppressed resentment finally boiling over. And there's the matter of the inheritance. Arthur Emsworth left everything to Gladys, of course, but now that Gladys is dead, who inherits? The daughter, naturally." Miss Marple watched as this theory gained traction among the assembled villagers. She observed how quickly they seized upon it, how readily they transformed a grieving daughter into a calculating poisoner. She also observed several things they did not: the way Timothy Fletcher kept wiping his palms on his trousers, the slight tremor in his hands, the way Margaret Blackwood's eyes kept darting toward the shattered pie dish, then away again, as if afraid to look too long, the way Dr. Haydock had positioned himself carefully between the refreshment table and the rest of the crowd. "Has anyone thought," Miss Marple ventured quietly, her voice so gentle it barely registered, "to wonder about the second slice?" Several heads turned toward her, but before anyone could respond, the sound of a car engine announced the arrival of Inspector Slack. The crowd parted instinctively as the inspector emerged from his vehicle, a thick-set man with a red face and the demeanor of a bull in a particularly fragile china shop. He surveyed the scene with evident irritation. "Right then," he barked. "Nobody leaves. I'll want statements from everyone, and someone fetch me that daughter. From what I hear, we won't need to look very far for our poisoner." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but anyone who knew her well might have recognized the particular quality of her stillness, the calm before she began, in her own quiet way, to prove everyone utterly and completely wrong. Inspector Slack had commandeered the vicar's study with the territorial aggression of a man who believed volume and certainty were adequate substitutes for actual detective work. Through the half-open door, the assembled villagers could hear his booming voice interrogating Rosemary Emsworth, and the poor woman stammered barely audible responses. Miss Marple had positioned herself in the church hall, ostensibly helping Mrs. Clement organize the leftover baked goods into containers. In truth, she was listening, not to the interrogation itself, which told her nothing she didn't already know, but to the conversations swirling around her like autumn leaves caught in competing winds. 27 years old when her father took ill, Mrs. Henderson was saying to a captive audience of 3 other women. 27, that's when a woman should be marrying, having children, living her life. But no, Arthur Emsworth demanded constant care, and Gladys insisted it had to be Rosemary. Wouldn't hear of hiring a proper nurse. "Saved them money, though, didn't it?" observed Mrs. Price, the greengrocer's wife. "And Arthur left quite a sum, I heard. Not a fortune, mind you, but comfortable. All to Gladys, of course." Miss Marple carefully wrapped a Victoria sponge in wax paper, her movements economical and precise. "I wonder," she murmured, as if to herself, whether Mrs. Emsworth had made a will of her own. The women turned toward her, and Mrs. Henderson's eyes lit up with the gleam of someone who possessed valuable information. As a matter of fact, she had. Just revised it last month. I know because my cousin works at Galloway & Sons. And the solicitors in Much Benham, everything goes to Rosemary, naturally, being the only child. The cottage, the investments, the lot. probably worth £30,000 all told. 30,000? Someone breathed, and the figure hung in the air like an accusation. Miss Marple wrapped another cake, her expression thoughtful. Curious timing to revise one's will. One wonders what prompted it. Before anyone could speculate, the study door burst open and Rosemary emerged, her face blotchy and tear-stained. Inspector Slack followed, looking like a cat who'd found a particularly satisfying canary. "Miss Emsworth will remain available for further questioning," he announced to the room at large. "I've advised her not to leave the village. As for the rest of you—" His gaze swept across the assembled crowd. "I'll need formal statements from anyone who was present when the deceased collapsed. You can give them to Constable Polk here." He gestured to a young, nervous-looking officer who'd been standing quietly by the door. "Surely you don't think Rosemary actually—" the vicar began, but Inspector Slack cut him off with an impatient wave. "Think? I don't need to think, Vicar. Facts speak for themselves. Miss Emsworth had means. She prepared the pie with her mother. She had opportunity. She cut and served every slice, and she had motive in abundance. Years of ill treatment and a £30,000 inheritance. Open and shut, if you ask me. Just need the toxicology report to confirm what we already know." Miss Marple observed that no one had, in fact, asked him, and she also observed that he'd apparently forgotten a rather important question. Which poison? Dr. Haydock had not specified, and different poisons suggested different levels of premeditation, different sources of acquisition, different suspects entirely. As if summoned by her thoughts, Dr. Haydock appeared in the hallway, his medical bag in hand. "Inspector, might I have a word?" Slack bristled at the interruption, but gestured for the doctor to approach. They spoke in low tones, but Miss Marple, whose hearing was considerably sharper than her age might suggest, caught fragments. "Arsenic, most likely. Symptoms consistent, but the speed of onset unusual, typically takes longer." "Arsenic," Inspector Slack said loudly, apparently abandoning any pretense of confidentiality. "Well, that settles it. Every household's got rat poison on hand. Easy enough for someone to slip it into food." But Miss Marple's needles, which had resumed their steady rhythm, paused for a fraction of a second. Arsenic was indeed common, but Dr. Haydock's hesitation was telling. The speed of onset was unusual. Most arsenic poisonings took hours to manifest, not minutes, which suggested either an enormous dose, difficult to disguise in food, or something else entirely. She became aware that Timothy Fletcher had approached the table where she sat, ostensibly to collect his chocolate gâteau, which remained largely uneaten. "Terrible business," he said, his voice unsteady. "Simply terrible. Mrs. Emsworth was, well, she was a remarkable woman." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied gently, her needles clicking softly. "You admired her cooking, I believe?" His hands trembled as he covered the cake. Oh, tremendously. She was a true artist. I've been trying to learn from her, you see. I asked her several times if she'd consider teaching me, perhaps sharing some of her techniques." His voice dropped, becoming bitter. "She always refused. Said her recipes were family secrets, not to be shared with amateurs and dilettantes. Those were her exact words." "How disappointing for you," Miss Marple observed, her tone sympathetic. "Particularly as you're clearly quite talented yourself. Your gâteau looks professional." He flushed with pleasure, though the expression quickly faded. "Lot of good it does me. This village only has eyes for— had eyes for—" He trailed off, seeming to realize what he'd said. Miss Marple's expression remained placid, but she'd noted the slip. Had eyes for. Past tense, used before he'd corrected himself. It was as if some part of him had already processed Mrs. Emsworth's death not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. "Well," she said mildly, "perhaps now you'll have the chance to shine on your own merits." By Monday morning, the entire village had convicted Rosemary Emsworth in the court of public opinion. Miss Marple, taking her customary morning walk past the row of shops on the high street, observed the phenomenon with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying tribal behavior. Outside the butcher's shop, Mrs. Henderson was holding forth to a group of avid listeners. "Mark my words, they'll have her in custody by week's end. Inspector Slack knows what he's about, whatever Miss Marple might think." This last was added with a pointed glance in Miss Marple's direction, though she gave no indication of having heard. The greengrocer's wife was equally certain. "Poor thing probably snapped. Years of abuse will do that to a person. Not that it excuses murder, mind you, but one can understand the desperation." Miss Marple continued her walk, nodding pleasantly to those she passed, and made her way to the post office. Margaret Blackwood was behind the counter, sorting the morning's mail with unusual vigor. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice carrying that peculiar mixture of sympathy and excitement that marked the bearer of dramatic news. "Have you heard? Inspector Slack searched the Emsworth cottage this morning. Found a tin of rat poison in the garden shed, arsenic-based, apparently. Half empty." "Indeed." Miss Marple purchased her stamps with careful deliberation. "I imagine most households have such things. Dreadful nuisances, rats." "Yes, but the tin had been recently opened. And there were traces, just traces, mind you, on one of the mixing bowls in the kitchen." Margaret leaned forward conspiratorially. "The bowl Rosemary used to prepare the pie filling. How very efficient of Inspector Slack to determine which bowl was used for what purpose." Miss Marple's tone was mild, but something in it made Margaret pause. "Well, I suppose Rosemary told him. She's been cooperative from what I hear. Probably hoping it makes her look innocent." Miss Marple collected her stamps and turned to leave, then paused as if something had just occurred to her. "Tell me, Margaret, you mentioned yesterday that you heard Mrs. Emsworth speak harshly to Rosemary at the post office last week. Were they collecting a parcel by chance?" Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, though her expression remained pleasant. "As a matter of fact, yes. A package from London, that catering company Dr. Haydock mentioned. Delacroix and Associates. They'd sent Mrs. Emsworth some sort of contract to review. She was quite excited about it, going on and on about how they wanted to market her recipes nationwide. Poor Rosemary just stood there looking miserable." "And did Mrs. Emsworth sign the contract here?" "No. She said she wanted to review it with her solicitor first. Wanted to make sure the terms were favorable." Margaret's expression turned calculating. "Now that you mention it, if she'd signed that contract, the recipes would have belonged to the company, wouldn't they? But dying before signing means they'd pass to Rosemary as part of the estate." "An interesting point," Miss Marple acknowledged, and then left the post office deep in thought. Her next stop was ostensibly social, a visit to the vicarage where Mrs. Clement was always glad of company. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that the vicar's wife, for all her charitable nature, possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of parish affairs. Over tea and biscuits that were slightly burnt, Mrs. Clement's baking never quite improved, Miss Marple gently steered the conversation toward the late Mrs. Emsworth. "Such a vibrant woman," Mrs. Clement sighed, "though I confess she could be rather difficult. Last month's Women's Institute meeting was quite uncomfortable. She made some rather cutting remarks about Mrs. Denton's cooking demonstration." "I heard something about that," Miss Marple encouraged gently. "It was most unpleasant. Mrs. Denton had been asked to demonstrate shepherd's pie. Nothing fancy, you understand. Just good, honest cooking." But Gladys interrupted constantly, pointing out supposed errors, suggesting improvements. She finally said, in front of everyone, that pedestrian cooking reflected a pedestrian mind. Mrs. Clement shook her head. Poor Mrs. Denton left in tears. "How unkind." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "I don't suppose Mrs. Denton attended the harvest festival." "Actually, she did. She brought a lovely apple tart. She's not one to hold grudges, thank goodness." Mrs. Clement paused, frowning. Though, now that you mention it, I did see her speaking with Gladys near the refreshment table, just before Gladys took that second slice of pie. Miss Marple set down her teacup with great care. How interesting. Was anyone else near the table at that time? Mrs. Clement's brow furrowed in concentration. Let me think. Dr. Haydock was there, of course, refilling his teacup, and young Timothy Fletcher was hovering about. He usually did when Gladys was present, poor boy, hoping for a kind word that never came. Oh, and Margaret Blackwood was clearing away some empty plates. She's always very helpful at these events. Quite a crowd, Miss Marple observed, all with access to the pie. But surely, Mrs. Clement looked confused. Surely the poison was in the pie when it arrived. That's what Inspector Slack said. Inspector Slack, Miss Marple replied gently, says a great many things. Not all of them are necessarily correct. She rose to leave, thanking Mrs. Clement for the tea. One thing troubles me particularly about this case. What's that? The second slice. Mrs. Emsworth was known for her pride in her cooking, certainly, but taking a second helping of one's own contribution at a church social, it seems rather immodest, not quite in character for someone so concerned with appearances. Mrs. Clement stared at her. Are you suggesting someone encouraged her to take it? I'm suggesting, Miss Marple said carefully, that we know remarkably little about those final 15 minutes before Mrs. Emsworth collapsed, and until we do, declaring anyone guilty would be most premature. That afternoon found Miss Marple in her garden, ostensibly deadheading roses, but actually contemplating the curious matter of timing. The autumn sun was warm on her back, and the familiar scent of earth and fading blooms provided the perfect atmosphere for concentrated thought. Mrs. Emsworth had taken her second slice of pie approximately 15 minutes before collapsing. The speed of the poisoning suggested a substantial dose, yet no one else who'd eaten the pie had been affected, not even slightly ill, which meant either the poison had been concentrated in one particular area of the pie, or it hadn't been in the pie at all when it was initially served. The click of the garden gate interrupted her musings. Dr. Haydock approached, his medical bag in hand, looking rather more careworn than usual. Miss Marple, I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I've just come from visiting old Mrs. Bantry, and I thought I might pick your brains about something. Please, do sit down, Miss Marple gestured to the garden bench. You look troubled, Doctor. He settled himself with a sigh. It's this wretched business with Gladys Emsworth. The preliminary toxicology report came back this morning. It was arsenic, as I suspected, but the concentration was extraordinary. Enough to kill a horse, frankly. Which raises the question of how anyone could have administered such a dose without the victim noticing immediately. Arsenic has rather a distinctive taste, I understand. Indeed. Bitter, metallic. Even disguised in heavily seasoned food, that amount should have been detectable. He rubbed his temples. Inspector Slack insists the pie must have been prepared with the poison already incorporated, which would distribute it throughout. But that makes no sense. Others ate the pie without ill effect. If someone added it afterward, to just one slice, the taste would have been overwhelming. Miss Marple snipped a particularly stubborn rose stem. Unless Mrs. Emsworth's taste had been somehow compromised. Dr. Haydock looked at her sharply. What do you mean? Well, I recall my nephew Raymond telling me about a case in London. A poisoner who gave his victim an extremely peppery soup before administering the fatal dose. The capsaicin temporarily numbed the taste buds, you see. She looked up from her pruning. Did Mrs. Emsworth consume anything particularly spicy or strong-tasting before that second slice? The doctor's eyes widened. By George, I don't know. I wasn't paying particular attention to what she was eating. He paused, thinking. Though now that you mention it, I do remember her drinking something. Not tea. She made rather a point of it, actually. Said she preferred her own special herbal tisane for digestion. She'd brought it in a flask. Her own flask, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. From her own home. Yes, she was quite particular about it. Some sort of strong-tasting herbal mixture. I caught a whiff when she poured it. Distinctly bitter. He stopped abruptly, his face paling. Good Lord, if someone had added the arsenic to her flask. The bitter taste would have been masked, Miss Marple finished gently. And the poison would have begun its work, weakening her, perhaps beginning to numb her senses, making her less likely to notice anything amiss with the pie. Dr. Haydock stood abruptly. I need to tell Slack immediately. The flask, it might still be at the Emsworth cottage, or perhaps in the things we collected from the scene. One moment, Doctor. Miss Marple's quiet voice stopped him. Before you speak to Inspector Slack, consider this. If the poison was in the flask, which Mrs. Emsworth brought from home, then it was almost certainly administered there before she came to the festival. Which means Rosemary still had access and opportunity, Dr. Haydock said heavily. In fact, it strengthens the case against her. She lived in the house, would have known about her mother's habits, could easily have tampered with the flask. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. That is certainly one interpretation, but it also means others could have had access. Anyone who visited the Emsworth cottage that morning, for instance. Did Mrs. Emsworth receive any visitors before the festival? I have no idea. Now you'd have to ask Rosemary, and the poor girl is in no state for questioning. Slack's had her in 3 times already. He shook his head. I'll inform the inspector about the flask theory. Let him sort out the details. That's his job, after all. After the doctor left, Miss Marple sat quietly on her bench, her knitting emerging from her bag as if by magic. Her needles moved in their familiar rhythm while her mind worked through the problem from another angle. The herbal tisane was interesting, very interesting indeed. A bitter drink that Mrs. Emsworth regularly consumed would be the perfect vehicle for poison. But Dr. Haydock had missed something important, something that his medical training should have caught. If the poison had been in the flask, Mrs. Emsworth would have begun showing symptoms much earlier than she did. And she'd drunk from it. Miss Marple was certain she'd seen her do so, at least 30 minutes before taking the second slice of pie. Yet she'd appeared perfectly healthy, perfectly herself, right up until those final 15 minutes, which suggested something rather more complicated than a simple poisoned flask or a poisoned pie. It suggested, in fact, a careful orchestration of events, a deliberate creation of false evidence, and a murderer who understood not only poisons, but also human nature and the predictable reactions of village gossip and police procedure. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. She thought of something her friend Sir Henry Clithering, formerly of Scotland Yard, had once told her. The cleverest murders weren't those that left no evidence, but those that left too much. All of it pointing in precisely the wrong direction. And the inquest was held on Wednesday at the village hall, and every available seat was occupied. Miss Marple arrived early, securing a position near the back where she could observe without being observed, a skill she'd cultivated to perfection over her many decades. The coroner, a dry-voiced man named Dr. Metcalf, conducted proceedings with efficient dispatch. Dr. Haydock gave his medical testimony, confirming arsenic poisoning and the unusually high concentration found in the deceased's system. The flask was produced as evidence. It had indeed been found among Mrs. Emsworth's belongings, and traces of arsenic had been detected in the residue at the bottom. However, Dr. Haydock added, his voice carrying a note of professional uncertainty, I must note that the timeline remains somewhat puzzling. The concentration found in the flask, while significant, should have produced symptoms within 15 to 20 minutes of consumption. Mrs. Emsworth drank from the flask at approximately 3 o'clock. She didn't collapse until nearly 4. Inspector Slack, called to give evidence, waved this concern aside with characteristic impatience. Poison affects different people at different rates, doesn't it, Doctor? Perhaps Mrs. Emsworth had a particularly strong constitution. Perhaps, Dr. Haydock conceded, though he looked unconvinced. Rosemary Emsworth was called next, and Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her knitting momentarily forgotten. The young woman looked dreadful. Her eyes were hollow, her skin had a greyish tinge, and her hands trembled visibly as she took her oath. "Miss Emsworth," the coroner said, not unkindly, "please describe the preparation of the pie that your mother brought to the harvest festival." Rosemary's voice was barely audible. "Mother made it Saturday evening. She did all the actual cooking, the pastry, the filling. I only helped with the washing up afterward. And on Sunday morning, before the festival. The pie was in the larder. Mother took it out around 2 o'clock to bring to room temperature. She said cold pie was unacceptable for serving." A ghost of a bitter smile crossed Rosemary's face. She was very particular about such things. And the flask containing her herbal tisane. She prepared it herself, as she always did. Sunday morning around 11 o'clock. She kept a special blend of herbs in a tin in the kitchen. Fennel, peppermint, something else I could never identify. She said it aided digestion. Did you observe her preparing it that morning? No, I was upstairs changing for church, but I saw the flask on the counter when I came down already filled. Inspector Slack interjected. And you had access to both the pie and the flask at all times? Rosemary's face flushed. I lived in the house, Inspector. I had access to everything, including the rat poison found in your garden shed. Objection, the coroner said mildly. Inspector, please confine yourself to factual testimony. But the damage was done. Miss Marple observed the ripple of whispers through the assembled crowd, the way heads turned to stare at Rosemary with undisguised suspicion. The coroner called several other witnesses. Villagers who testified to Mrs. Emsworth's actions at the festival, the timing of events, and the apparent normalcy of the pie when it was served. Timothy Fletcher, looking pale but composed, confirmed that he'd spoken to Mrs. Emsworth about 20 minutes before her collapse. She seemed in excellent spirits, he testified. Perhaps a bit flushed, but I attributed that to the warm afternoon and her natural excitement at the festival's success. Did you observe her eating or drinking anything during your conversation? Timothy hesitated. She had a flask with her. She took a drink from it while we spoke. She offered me some, actually, said it was marvelous for the constitution, but I declined. I don't care for herbal teas. This revelation produced another murmur. Miss Marple's needles resumed their clicking, but her eyes remained fixed on Timothy Fletcher, and he'd positioned himself carefully in his testimony, admitting to proximity, even to opportunity, but presenting himself as an innocent bystander. Very clever, or perhaps very truthful. It was difficult to distinguish the two without more information. Margaret Blackwood was called and testified to seeing Mrs. Emsworth near the refreshment table in those final minutes. She was examining the pie, what was left of it. I remember thinking how proud she looked. Then Mrs. Denton approached her. Mrs. Denton? The coroner looked up from his notes. Mrs. Helen Denton. Yes, sir. They spoke for a moment. I couldn't hear what was said. Then Mrs. Emsworth laughed, not a kind laugh, if you understand me, and cut herself another slice of pie. A large one. Mrs. Denton walked away, looking quite upset. This was new information, and Miss Marple observed how it sent a visible tremor through the crowd. Mrs. Denton, seated 3 rows ahead, had gone rigid. The coroner made a note. We'll need to speak with Mrs. Denton. Is she present? Mrs. Denton rose slowly, a small, plump woman with grey hair and the perpetually anxious expression of someone expecting criticism. I'm here, sir. Mrs. Denton, can you confirm this exchange with Mrs. Emsworth? Yes, sir. Her voice quavered. I went to apologize to her. Apologize? For what? Mrs. Denton's hands twisted together. For my shepherd's pie at the Women's Institute last month. She'd said such cutting things about it, and I wanted to make peace. I told her I knew my cooking wasn't sophisticated like hers, but I'd been working on improving my technique. She drew a shaky breath. She laughed at me and said some people were born cooks and others should stick to buying from shops. Then she cut herself that second slice and said, "This is what real cooking tastes like, Helen. Perhaps you should take notes." The cruelty of it hung in the air. Miss Marple saw several people shift uncomfortably, their certainty about Rosemary's guilt perhaps wavering slightly. The coroner adjourned the inquest pending further investigation, recording a verdict of murder by person or persons unknown. As the crowd filed out, Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting in her lap, her mind working through the newest pieces of this increasingly complex puzzle. Mrs. Denton had been the last person to speak with Mrs. Emsworth before she took that fatal second slice. And Mrs. Denton had motive, perhaps not for murder, but certainly for humiliation and anger. But was wounded pride sufficient motive for murder? In Miss Marple's experience, it very rarely was. Unless, of course, there was something more to Mrs. Denton's story than a simple cooking rivalry. Miss Marple had learned long ago that the best time to observe human nature was not during formal interrogations, but in the unguarded moments afterward, when people believed themselves unwatched. She positioned herself near the village hall steps, apparently struggling with her knitting bag, while the crowd dispersed around her. Mrs. Denton emerged looking shaken and was immediately intercepted by Miss Hartnell, who had the tenacity of a terrier when gossip was concerned. "Helen, my dear, that must have been dreadful for you. To think you were the last person to speak with her." "It was awful," Mrs. Denton said, her voice breaking, like I only wanted to make amends. "I never wished her harm, never. But now everyone will think—" "Nonsense," Miss Hartnell said, though her tone suggested she thought precisely that. "No one could imagine you capable of such a thing. Why, you're the gentlest soul in the village." As they moved away, Miss Marple observed Timothy Fletcher hovering near the hall entrance, apparently waiting for someone. When Rosemary Emsworth finally emerged, supported by the vicar's wife, Timothy approached her with evident hesitation. "Miss Emsworth, I'm terribly sorry about all this. If there's anything I can do, anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask." Rosemary looked at him with dull, exhausted eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Fletcher. That's kind of you." "I mean it," he pressed. "I know something about living under difficult circumstances. My own mother was— Well, that's not important now. But I understand what it's like to feel trapped, to feel that everyone expects you to be something you're not." His voice dropped lower. "And I know your mother could be very difficult." Mrs. Clement gently steered Rosemary away before she could respond, but Miss Marple had caught the flash of something in Timothy Fletcher's eyes. Sympathy, certainly, but also something more calculating. Recognition, perhaps, of a kindred spirit, or the opportunism of a man who saw advantage in befriending the now wealthy heiress. Miss Marple finally managed to extract herself from the village hall and made her way slowly homeward. She had just reached her garden gate when Dr. Haydock's car pulled up alongside her. "Miss Marple, might I have a word? Something's been troubling me." She invited him in, and soon they were seated in her comfortable sitting room with tea, properly made, not like poor Mrs. Clement's efforts, between them. "It's about the autopsy findings," Dr. Haydock began, then paused. "This is confidential, you understand." "Naturally." The arsenic concentration in Mrs. Emsworth's stomach contents was relatively low, not nearly enough to account for death. The lethal dose was in her bloodstream, which suggests it had been absorbed sometime before her final meal. But here's what troubles me. There was also arsenic in the liver and kidneys at levels suggesting exposure over several days, possibly weeks. Miss Marple set down her teacup with great care. Chronic poisoning. Possibly. Small doses over time, not enough to cause obvious symptoms, but enough to accumulate in the tissues. Then, on Sunday, a massive final dose to finish the job. He ran his hand through his hair. Which means this wasn't a sudden crime of passion. Someone had been poisoning Gladys Emsworth slowly, methodically for weeks. Sunday's dose was merely the coup de grace, And Rosemary lived in the house throughout that period, Miss Marple observed quietly. Yes, but so did... He stopped. Well, actually, no one else did. Arthur Emsworth died 2 years ago. It's been just Rosemary and her mother since then. No visitors, no regular callers. Dr. Haydock frowned. I suppose there must have been some. The tradespeople, certainly. Margaret Blackwood with the post. Mrs. Denton visited occasionally. She and Gladys were on the church flower committee together before their falling out. He paused. And Timothy Fletcher. Mr. Fletcher visited Mrs. Emsworth. Regularly, from what I understand. Started about 3 months ago. He was quite persistent about learning her cooking techniques, despite her repeated refusals to teach him. Gladys mentioned it to my wife once, said the boy was becoming a nuisance, always finding excuses to drop by. Miss Marple absorbed this information with no visible reaction, but her mind was racing. 3 months of visits, ample opportunity to administer small doses of poison, particularly if one were offering to help with cooking, tasting ingredients, testing seasonings, all perfectly innocent behaviors that could mask something far more sinister. Doctor, I wonder if you might do me a small favor. Could you discover discreetly whether Mr. Fletcher has any training in chemistry or pharmacy, or perhaps access to such materials through his employment? He works at Galloway & Sons, the solicitors. I can't imagine what access that would give him to poisons. But Dr. Haydock was looking thoughtful, though I suppose I could make some inquiries. After the doctor left, Miss Marple sat for a long while in contemplation. The case was becoming clearer, but also more troubling. Chronic poisoning suggested premeditation of the coldest kind. Not a moment of rage or desperation, but a calculated plan executed over weeks. It suggested someone patient, methodical, and utterly ruthless. Rosemary had all those opportunities, certainly, but she also seemed genuinely shattered by her mother's death. Of course, guilt could produce that effect as easily as grief. Yet something in Miss Marple's long experience with human nature suggested that Rosemary Emsworth, for all her repressed resentment, lacked the sustained viciousness required for such a crime. Timothy Fletcher, on the other hand, had been visiting the house regularly, had been rebuffed repeatedly in his requests for teaching, had a clear path to advancement if the village's premier cook were removed from the scene, and had shown, in his testimony, a careful attention to self-preservation. But there was still the matter of the flask and the second slice of pie. Someone had wanted to ensure that Mrs. Emsworth died not just that day, but at that specific time, in that public setting. Why? What purpose did the timing serve? Miss Marple rose and went to her writing desk, extracting a piece of paper. On it, she began to write a careful timeline of Sunday's events, noting every person who'd had access to Mrs. Emsworth, the pie, or the flask. Somewhere in those details lay the answer. She simply had to look at them from the correct angle. Thursday morning brought an unexpected development. Miss Marple was in her sitting room reviewing her timeline when Miss Hartnell burst through the door with considerably less decorum than the hour warranted. "Jane, the most extraordinary thing. Timothy Fletcher has been taken in for questioning." Miss Marple set aside her papers with deliberate calm. "Indeed. On what grounds?" Apparently someone, they won't say who, informed Inspector Slack that Timothy had been seen near the Emsworth cottage very early Sunday morning, before church even. And when they searched his rooms above the bakery, and they found a book. Miss Hartnell paused dramatically. A book on poisons and their uses, with several pages dog-eared, including the section on arsenic. "How very incriminating," Miss Marple murmured, though one might say suspiciously so. "Rather like leaving a signed confession on one's mantle." Miss Hartnell looked confused. "What do you mean?" "Simply that a person clever enough to commit slow, methodical poisoning over several weeks would hardly be foolish enough to keep such obvious evidence lying about. Unless, of course, they wanted it to be found." "Wanted?" But why on earth would anyone want to incriminate themselves? Not themselves, Miss Marple corrected gently. But what if someone else wanted to ensure the evidence pointed firmly at Mr. Fletcher? Before Miss Hartnell could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Haydock, who looked grimmer than Miss Marple had ever seen him. "You've heard about young Fletcher?" he asked without preamble. "Miss Hartnell has just informed me. There's more. I made those inquiries you requested. Timothy Fletcher's mother died 3 years ago. The death was attributed to natural causes, heart failure, but she'd been ill for some months beforehand. Weakness, digestive troubles, hair loss." He met Miss Marple's eyes, all symptoms consistent with chronic arsenic poisoning. The silence that followed was profound. Miss Hartnell's face had gone pale. "You think he murdered his own mother?" No inquest was held at the time. She was elderly, had been in declining health. The local doctor in their village in Somerset attributed everything to age and a weak constitution. Doctor, and Haydock sat heavily in the nearest chair. But if someone knew about those circumstances and checked the records, they might have put 2 and 2 together, and if they wanted to deflect suspicion from themselves, they would ensure that connection came to light, Miss Marple finished. How very clever, and how very cruel. Because now everyone will assume Mr. Fletcher is a serial poisoner, when in fact his mother may well have died of entirely natural causes. "But the book on poisons," Miss Hartnell protested. "Can be purchased by anyone with a shilling and a trip to the bookshop," Miss Marple pointed out, "and placed in anyone's rooms by someone who had access, who delivers baked goods to the rooms above the bakery. I wonder, who might have legitimate reason to enter?" Dr. Haydock's eyes widened. "Good Lord, and the baker's wife makes deliveries to the tenants. Mrs. Price from the greengrocer's is her sister. They often help each other with deliveries, and Mrs. Price serves on multiple committees, has access to village records, knows everyone's business. As does Margaret Blackwood," Miss Marple added quietly. "The postmistress sees every letter that comes and goes." She mentioned the package from the London Catering Company. She would have known about Mrs. Emsworth's contract negotiations, known the timing, known that the recipes might become quite valuable. "But Margaret has no connection to the Emsworths," Dr. Haydock objected. "No motive, doesn't she?" Miss Marple rose and retrieved a newspaper clipping she'd tucked into her knitting bag. "I took the liberty of reviewing some back issues of the County Gazette at the library yesterday. 6 years ago, there was a small notice about a recipe competition in Much Benham. First prize went to a Mrs. M. Blackwood for her signature meat and potato pie. The article notes that Mrs. Gladys Emsworth contested the results, claiming the winning recipe was remarkably similar to her own family recipe. She handed the clipping to Dr. Haydock. The judges dismissed Mrs. Emsworth's complaint as poor sportsmanship. Mrs. Blackwood received £50 and considerable local acclaim. Mrs. Emsworth received public humiliation, something I suspect she never forgave or forgot. But that was 6 years ago, Miss Hartnell said. Surely that's not motive for murder now. Not by itself, perhaps. But consider, Mrs. Emsworth was about to sign a contract with a London company, and her recipes, including the disputed pie recipe, would have been scrutinized, authenticated, possibly even investigated for provenance. What if someone discovered that the prize-winning recipe actually had been stolen? The scandal would have been considerable. Mrs. Blackwood would have been exposed as a fraud and a thief. Dr. Haydock was nodding slowly. And Margaret has been to the Emsworth cottage regularly, delivering post, serving on committees with Gladys. She'd have had opportunity to add small amounts of arsenic to food or drink over time. She was also at the festival, Miss Marple continued, clearing plates, moving about the refreshment table. She testified to seeing Mrs. Emsworth take that second slice. But what if she encouraged it? What if she'd added the final, a lethal dose to that particular section of the pie while pretending to tidy up? Then planted the evidence to implicate Timothy Fletcher, knowing his mother's death would look suspicious under scrutiny. Dr. Haydick finished. My God, it's diabolical. It's also, Miss Marple said calmly, still largely speculation. We have no proof. What we need is for someone to make a mistake, and in my experience, murderers always do, eventually. Miss Marple's opportunity came sooner than expected, though not in the manner she'd anticipated. That same afternoon, as she was returning from posting a letter, she encountered Margaret Blackwood locking up the post office for her afternoon break. Miss Marple, Margaret greeted her with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Terrible business about Timothy Fletcher. Though I suppose we should have seen it coming. Still waters run deep, as they say. Indeed they do. Miss Marple adjusted her shopping basket. Though I've always found that the deepest waters are often the clearest, it's the shallow, murky ones that hide the most dangerous things. Something flickered across Margaret's face. Too quick to identify, but not quick enough to escape Miss Marple's notice. I've been thinking, Miss Marple continued conversationally, about that recipe competition 6 years ago. Such an achievement, winning with your meat and potato pie. You must have been very proud. Margaret's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Yes, well, some people couldn't accept that others might be equally talented. Gladys Emsworth made quite a fuss at the time, as you may have heard. Oh, I had heard something about it. She claimed the recipe was similar to her own, didn't she? Most unpleasant for you, having your triumph clouded by such accusations. Ridiculous accusations, Margaret said sharply. The judges investigated thoroughly and found no merit to her claims. My recipe was entirely my own creation. Of course. Miss Marple's tone was soothing, though I imagine it must have been distressing when you heard about Mrs. Emsworth's contract with that London company. One does worry about these things being dredged up again, doesn't one? Companies can be so thorough in their investigations, especially when authenticating recipes for commercial use. Margaret had gone very still. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, my dear. Simply observing that Mrs. Emsworth's death was remarkably convenient for certain people. The contract will never be signed now. The recipes will remain private family property, and there will be no uncomfortable investigations into their origins. Miss Marple paused delicately. Of course, that assumes the recipes passed to someone who won't pursue the London contract. Poor Rosemary seems unlikely to have much interest in commercial ventures. If you're suggesting, Margaret began, her voice low and dangerous. I'm suggesting nothing, Miss Marple interrupted gently. But I am going to share an observation with you. You see, I've been thinking about that flask of herbal tea. Dr. Haydick believes the main dose of poison was administered through it, but the timing never quite worked. Mrs. Emsworth drank from the flask at 3 o'clock but didn't show symptoms until nearly 4. Arsenic doesn't work that slowly with the concentration that was found. Margaret's face had lost some of its color, but she said nothing. So I asked myself, Miss Marple continued, what if the flask was poisoned, but not on Sunday? What if small amounts had been added over weeks, building up in Mrs. Emsworth's system? Then, on Sunday, someone needed only to ensure she consumed something, anything, with a final dose. The pie, for instance. Not the whole pie, of course. That would be too obvious. Just one slice. Perhaps a slice that was suggested to her by someone she was speaking with. Someone who knew she'd be unable to resist the temptation to demonstrate her superiority. One final time. This is pure fantasy, Margaret said, but her voice lacked conviction. Is it? You see, I remembered something from Sunday. When Mrs. Emsworth collapsed, her pie dish shattered on the ground. But there was still one slice remaining on the serving table, the slice next to the one she'd taken. After the ambulance left, I noticed that slice had been cleared away, though most of the other food remained. I thought that was odd, almost as if someone wanted to ensure that particular slice couldn't be tested for poison. Margaret's hands had clenched into fists. You're making wild accusations based on nothing. Perhaps. But I also remember that you mentioned seeing Mrs. Denton speak with Mrs. Emsworth before she took that second slice. You were quite specific about it, almost as if you wanted to ensure we knew Mrs. Denton had been there, had opportunity, had motive from that dreadful scene at the Women's Institute. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, almost conversational. It's just as you wanted to ensure we knew about Timothy Fletcher's visits to the cottage, his interest in Mrs. Emsworth's recipes, his mother's convenient death. You've been very helpful in pointing out suspects, Margaret. Almost too helpful. I won't listen to any more of this. Margaret turned to leave, but Miss Marple's next words stopped her. The police have the remaining food from the festival, you know. Inspector Slack may be overly confident in his conclusions, but he's not entirely incompetent. He'll test everything eventually, including the scraps that were collected from the bins. When he finds arsenic in that cleared-away slice, the one positioned beside Mrs. Emsworth, he'll want to know who had the opportunity to place it there, and who had reason to remove the evidence afterward. Margaret stood frozen, her back to Miss Marple. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. She destroyed me. 6 years ago, she stood up at that competition and called me a thief in front of everyone. They investigated, yes, and they found nothing because there was nothing to find. That recipe was mine, developed over months of experimentation. But she never let it rest. She told everyone who would listen that I'd stolen from her. My victory became a joke, a scandal. People looked at me sideways for years. So you decided to destroy her in return. Margaret turned, and her face was terrible in its naked hatred. She was going to do it again. That London contract would have meant interviews, publicity, investigations into recipe provenance. She would have made her accusations public all over again, and this time, with money at stake. People might have believed her, and I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let her ruin me twice. Miss Marple regarded Margaret Blackwood with a mixture of sadness and something approaching pity. So you poisoned her flask over several weeks. Small amounts that she wouldn't notice in the bitter herbal tea. It was easy, Margaret said, her voice hollow now, as if confession had drained something essential from her. I delivered post to the cottage twice weekly. Gladys kept the flask on the kitchen counter, always prepared in advance. A few grains of arsenic from my own rat poison, dissolved in water, added when rosemary was elsewhere. The herbal mixture disguised any taste perfectly. But you couldn't wait for the chronic poisoning to finish its work. She was meeting with her solicitor on Monday. The contract was to be signed Tuesday. I'd run out of time. Margaret's laugh was bitter. I thought about letting it go, accepting defeat. But then at the festival, I saw my opportunity. She was so proud, so insufferably proud of that wretched pie. I'd brought a small vial with me, just in case, though I wasn't certain I'd use it. When I was clearing plates, I added the contents to the last remaining slice, the one positioned at the edge of the dish. Then I simply suggested to Gladys that she ought to have another piece, show everyone what real cooking looked like after her conversation with poor Helen Denton. And she took the poisoned slice. She took it eagerly, wanted to prove her superiority one final time. Margaret's face contorted. The irony is, her pie wasn't even that remarkable. Good, certainly, but not the masterpiece she proclaimed it to be. My recipe was better, is better. But she couldn't accept that anyone else might be talented, might deserve recognition. So you killed her, and then you set about framing others. First Rosemary, then Timothy Fletcher. Rosemary was the obvious suspect. Everyone would believe she'd finally snapped after years of abuse. I simply ensured the evidence pointed that direction, mentioning the inheritance, the rat poison in their shed. Margaret's voice grew colder. But when Inspector Slack seemed slow to arrest her, I needed a backup. Timothy was perfect. His regular visits, his persistent interest in Gladys's recipes, his mother's death. I'd heard whispers about that from someone in Somerset. It wasn't difficult to obtain a book on poisons and leave it in his rooms. The baker's wife never locks the building's side entrance. You were very thorough, Miss Marple observed. Except for one thing. What's that? You underestimated the power of human observation, not official police observation. Inspector Slack sees only what confirms his assumptions, but the quiet watching of those who understand human nature. Miss Marple's voice hardened slightly. You destroyed a life out of wounded pride and fear of exposure. That's not justice, Margaret. That's murder, plain and simple. She would have destroyed me first, Margaret said, but the defiance in her voice had faded. Perhaps. Or perhaps her London contract would have proceeded without any mention of your competition recipe. You'll never know now, will you? You acted out of fear and hatred, and in doing so, you've destroyed not just Gladys Emsworth, but yourself as well. Margaret seemed to crumple then, the reality of what she'd done, and what would come next, finally penetrating. What happens now? Now, said a voice from behind them, you come with me. Both women turned to find Inspector Slack standing at the corner of the building, Dr. Haydock beside him. The inspector's face bore an expression of profound irritation, not with Margaret, but with himself. Been listening the whole time, have you, Miss Marple? He growled. Couldn't have mentioned your suspicions to the police before conducting your own interrogation? I did try to hint at the timeline inconsistencies, Inspector, but you seemed quite satisfied with your original theory. Miss Marple's tone was mild. Besides, I had no proof, only observations and logic. And I needed confirmation from the source. Confession obtained under false pretenses won't hold up in court. Slack blustered, though without much conviction. On the contrary, Dr. Haydock interjected. Miss Marple suggested I fetch you over an hour ago, Inspector, after she'd worked out the solution. You heard a voluntary confession from a suspect who was not under arrest and had not been cautioned. Miss Blackwood could have walked away at any time. She chose to speak. Margaret Blackwood stood silently as Inspector Slack placed her under arrest, reciting the formal caution she should have received earlier. She offered no resistance, asked for no solicitor, seemed almost relieved to have the burden of her secret finally lifted. As the police car drove away with Margaret in the back seat, Doctor, Haydock turned to Miss Marple with undisguised admiration. How did you know she'd confess? She could have simply denied everything, and you'd have had no proof. Oh, but I did have proof, Doctor. Not the sort that would satisfy a court initially, but enough to prompt proper investigation. The bins from the festival hadn't been emptied yet. I checked yesterday. The police would have found the poisoned slice eventually, and once they tested it and compared it to the rat poison from Margaret's home, the case would have been clear. She adjusted her gloves with a small sigh. But more than that, I knew Margaret would confess because guilt is a terrible burden. She'd been carrying it for days, watching innocent people suffer suspicion. Whatever her original justification, her conscience was already punishing her. So she wanted to be caught, needed to be, really. The human soul can only bear so much before it seeks absolution, even through punishment. Still, Dr. Haydock said, you took a considerable risk confronting her alone. Not entirely alone, Doctor. I told you where I'd be and when, and I'm not without resources. She smiled slightly. I've spent 80-some years observing human nature in all its variations. That provides a certain insurance policy. They walked together back toward the village center, where the news of Margaret Blackwood's arrest would already be spreading like wildfire through the interconnected network of St. Mary Mead gossip. There would be shock, denial, endless speculation about what they'd all missed. By evening, the entire village had assembled in small clusters outside the church hall, the post office, and in the various shops along the high street. The news of Margaret Blackwood's arrest had produced a collective shock that manifested in endless, circular conversations repeating the same sentiments: disbelief, retrospective claims of having always known something was off, and considerable embarrassment at how thoroughly they'd been misdirected. Miss Marple, returning from the police station where she'd given her formal statement, found herself intercepted by nearly every villager she passed. She responded to each with her characteristic gentle courtesy, neither gloating over her success nor criticizing those who jumped to wrong conclusions. She understood that human nature, when confronted with murder, instinctively sought the most obvious explanation, and that a clever murderer could exploit that tendency masterfully. Now, the vicarage drawing room had become an unofficial gathering place for those seeking authoritative information, and Miss Marple found herself seated in the place of honor, teacup in hand, surrounded by an audience hungry for details. "I still can't believe it was Margaret," Mrs. Clement said for perhaps the 10th time. "She seemed so normal, so helpful. She was on 3 church committees." "Murderers often do seem normal, my dear," Miss Marple replied gently. "That's rather the point. They live among us, go about their daily business, participate in community life. The capacity for violence exists in all of us under the right, or rather, wrong, circumstances." "But to kill over a pie recipe," Miss Hartnell exclaimed, her voice shrill with indignation. "It seemed so trivial, so absurd." Not to Margaret, it wasn't. Dr. Haydock had joined them looking tired, but somehow more settled than he'd been in days. For her, that recipe represented her one moment of achievement, of recognition. When Gladys Emsworth tried to destroy that, first 6 years ago, then again with the London contract, Margaret saw it as an existential threat to her entire identity. "Pride," the vicar said quietly. "It's one of the 7 deadly sins for good reason. Both women were consumed by it. Gladys with her need to be acknowledged as superior, Margaret with her need to protect her reputation. And it led to tragedy." Miss Marple nodded. "Pride, yes, but also fear. Margaret acted not just from wounded vanity, but from genuine terror that her life's work, modest though it might seem to others, would be stripped from her and exposed as fraudulent, even though it wasn't. Their fear makes people desperate, and desperate people are capable of terrible things." "What will happen to Rosemary now?" Mrs. Clement asked. "The poor girl has been through such an ordeal, suspected of matricide, when all along she was innocent." "She inherits the estate, I understand," Dr. Haydock said. £30,000 and the cottage, though I suspect she'll want to sell it. Too many painful memories." "I saw her this afternoon," Miss Marple said. "She was with Timothy Fletcher, actually. He'd been released from custody, of course, and went immediately to apologize for, well, I'm not quite sure what for, but young people do like to apologize. They were discussing the possibility of her selling some of Mrs. Emsworth's recipes to the London company, after all. Mr. And Fletcher offered to help her prepare them for presentation." Miss Hartnell's eyebrows rose. "How very enterprising of him, and convenient, I suppose, now that Rosemary has means." "Now, Caroline," Miss Marple chided gently, "let's not be cynical. The young man has genuine talent as a baker, and he showed Rosemary considerable kindness when others were quick to condemn her. Sometimes a shared ordeal creates a bond between people. Whether it develops into something more, time will tell." The conversation turned to other matters. The upcoming church fete, the repair of the roof, the question of who would take over Margaret's duties at the post office. Gradually, the gathering dispersed, people returning to their homes with a peculiar mixture of satisfaction and unease that comes from having a murder solved in one's midst. Dear Miss Marple walked home slowly through the gathering dusk, her knitting bag swinging gently from her arm. The village looked peaceful, eternal, unchanged, but she knew better. St. Mary Mead would carry the scar of this crime for years to come. Margaret Blackwood's name would become a cautionary tale, invoked in whispers when someone displayed excessive pride or resentment. Mrs. Emsworth would be remembered not for her cooking, but for being murdered. And Rosemary would forever be that poor girl whose mother was poisoned. As she reached her cottage gate, Miss Marple paused to admire the last roses of the season, their petals tinged with brown, but still fragrant. She thought of something her nephew Raymond had once said, that she saw murder everywhere because she looked for the worst in people. But that wasn't quite accurate. She didn't look for the worst. She simply recognized that the worst existed, potential and waiting in even the most ordinary circumstances. A recipe competition, a moment of public humiliation, a fear of exposure. These small, everyday cruelties could accumulate like drops of water, each one insignificant until suddenly the vessel overflowed and tragedy resulted. The key was understanding that capacity for darkness while not being consumed by cynicism. To observe human nature honestly, its pettiness, its pride, its capacity for violence, while still maintaining faith in its potential for kindness, courage, and redemption. Inside her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her favorite chair with her knitting. The wool passed through her fingers in its familiar rhythm, creating something useful and beautiful from mere string. Rather like detective work, really. Taking scattered threads of evidence and observation, following their patterns, and ultimately revealing the picture they'd been forming all along. Outside, St. Mary Mead settled into its evening routines. Lamps lit in windows, families gathering for dinner, the church bells marking the hour. Life continued as it always did, absorbing tragedy and moving forward. By next week, the village would be consumed with some new drama, a disputed property line, perhaps, or a scandal at the Women's Institute. But Miss Marple would remember. She always did. Each case added to her vast internal catalogue of human behavior, providing reference points for future observations. Because there would be future cases. She was quite certain of that. Where people gathered, conflict inevitably followed. And where there was conflict, the potential for violence was never far behind. 3 weeks later, Miss Marple sat in the visiting room of Holloway Prison, her handbag resting primly on her lap, waiting for Margaret Blackwood to be brought in. She had debated whether to make this visit. There was no obligation, no social requirement that demanded it. But something in her had felt the need for completion, for a final conversation that might provide understanding, if not closure. Margaret appeared diminished in her prison dress, her hair limp and unstyled, her face pale without its usual careful application of powder and rouge. She sat across from Miss Marple with evident reluctance, her eyes fixed on the scarred table between them. "I didn't expect visitors," she said finally, her voice flat. Certainly not you." "I wanted to understand," Miss Marple said simply. "The facts of the case are clear enough, but facts only tell us what happened, not why. Not really." Margaret's laugh was hollow. "Why does anyone murder? Hatred, fear, desperation. Take your pick. I felt all three. But it went deeper than the recipe competition, didn't it?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle, not accusing. "I've been thinking about it a great deal. A single humiliation, even a public one, doesn't usually lead to murder 6 years later. There had to be more." For a long moment, Margaret said nothing. Then, as if a dam had broken, the words came rushing out. "She took everything from me, not just the recognition, though God knows that mattered. But after the competition, after her accusations, people treated me differently. The man I was courting, a solicitor from Much Benham, broke off our understanding. Said he couldn't be associated with someone embroiled in scandal, even if the accusations had been dismissed. I was 43 years old. That was my last real chance at marriage, at children, at a life beyond the post office counter." She looked up, and her eyes were fierce with old pain. Gladys Emsworth had everything: a husband, a home, a daughter, respect. And she couldn't bear that I might have one small thing, one tiny victory that was mine alone. She had to try to destroy it, had to ensure everyone knew she was superior. And in doing so, she destroyed my entire future. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "So when you heard about the London contract, you saw history repeating itself?" "I saw her preparing to do it all again. To stand before the world and call me a thief, to resurrect that scandal with national publicity this time. and I realized that if I didn't stop her, I'd spend the rest of my life in her shadow, always the woman who'd stolen Gladys Emsworth's recipe, always suspect, always diminished. Margaret's hands clenched on the table. I couldn't bear it. I simply couldn't bear it anymore. And so you chose murder over endurance. I chose survival, Margaret said sharply. Or what I thought was survival. Though I suppose I've only succeeded in destroying myself more thoroughly than Gladys ever could have. She paused, then added more quietly, "The ironic thing is, I've been thinking about that recipe, replaying it in my mind, wondering if perhaps there was some unconscious influence from having tasted her pie years before. Maybe she was right all along. Maybe I am a thief and I've been lying to myself for 6 years." "That's guilt speaking," Miss Marple said firmly. "Guilt makes us doubt everything about ourselves, question every action, every motive. You may have been wrong to murder, Margaret, but that doesn't mean you were wrong about the recipe. 2 cooks can independently create similar dishes. It happens all the time. Does it matter now? Perhaps not legally, but for your own peace of mind, yes, I think it does." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "You committed a terrible crime, and you'll pay a terrible price for it. But don't compound that by accepting false guilt on top of true guilt. Own what you actually did, but don't take responsibility for imaginary sins as well." Margaret looked at her with something approaching wonder. "Why did you come here? To absolve me? To judge me?" "Neither. To understand." Miss Marple gathered her handbag, preparing to leave. "I've spent my life observing human nature, and each person I meet teaches me something new about the complexity of motivation, the weight of circumstance, the terrible things that ordinary people are capable of under pressure. You've taught me that even the most methodical evil can stem from a wound that never healed, a pain that never stopped throbbing. That doesn't excuse it." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "It doesn't. But understanding isn't the same as excusing. I can comprehend how you arrived at murder without condoning that you did so." She rose to leave, then paused. "One more thing. Rosemary Emsworth asked me to tell you something if I saw you. She said to tell you she forgives you." Margaret's face crumpled. "How can she? I killed her mother." "Her mother who made her life a misery for decades," Miss Marple said quietly. "Rosemary is free now. Free to live, to make choices, to find happiness. She doesn't want to carry hatred along with that freedom. She wants to move forward unburdened. And she hopes you might find some small measure of peace, despite everything." The walk back through London to the railway station gave Miss Marple ample time for reflection. The city's crowds pressed around her, thousands of souls each carrying their own burdens of joy and sorrow, pride and shame, love and hatred. Any one of them, under the right circumstances, might be capable of murder or of forgiveness. Human nature contained multitudes. On the train back to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple took out her knitting, a soft blue jumper for her great-nephew, growing so quickly these days. The needles clicked in their familiar rhythm, and she watched the countryside roll past the window. Autumn fields lying fallow, trees stripped bare, everything waiting for winter's arrival and spring's eventual return. St. Mary Mead would heal, as it always did. Already the gossip had shifted to other matters. The vicar's controversial sermon on charity, young Timothy Fletcher's surprisingly successful sponge cake at last week's church social, the budding romance between him and Rosemary Emsworth that had the entire village taking sides on whether it was touching or opportunistic. Life continued. That was its nature, its persistence. Even murder, that most final of human acts, couldn't stop the forward momentum of ordinary existence. But people adapted, adjusted, found ways to incorporate tragedy into their narratives and move forward. As the train pulled into the station, Miss Marple carefully packed away her knitting. She could see Miss Hartnell waiting on the platform, no doubt bursting with some new piece of village news. The afternoon tea at the vicarage would be filled with conversation and speculation, the comfortable rhythms of small-town life reasserting themselves. But Miss Marple would carry with her the memory of Margaret Blackwood's face, the understanding that pride and fear could transform an ordinary woman into a killer, and the quiet satisfaction of having brought truth to light. Not justice, perhaps. That was for the courts to dispense. But truth, which was sometimes more important. She stepped off the train into the familiar embrace of St. Mary Mead, where she belonged, where she understood every nuance of behavior, every undercurrent of emotion. Home, with all its small cruelties and unexpected kindnesses, its capacity for both murder and redemption. And if another puzzle should present itself, another death that seemed straightforward but wasn't, another killer hidden among the familiar faces, well, Miss Jane Marple would be ready. Her knitting needles, her sharp eyes, and her comprehensive understanding of human nature were always at the service of truth. The village needed that, whether it knew it or not. Because evil, as she'd learned long ago, didn't announce itself with dramatic flourishes. It arrived quietly, disguised as ordinary resentment, everyday pride, commonplace fear. And it took someone who understood those quiet transformations to recognize when they'd crossed the line from human weakness into something far more dangerous. Miss Marple smiled gently at Miss Hartnell's enthusiastic greeting and allowed herself to be swept up in the latest village drama, something about disputed rose bushes and property lines. Life, in all its ridiculous, tragic, beautiful complexity, continued, and she wouldn't have it any other way.